So in this video, I'm going to explain my own recommendations for the propositions. But I want to be clear that these are my own personal views. I'm not speaking in my capacity as the assistant director for the Institute on Ethics, Law, and Public Policy. And so both Eric and I felt like it was really important that when we did our analysis of the propositions, we are completely nonpartisan, non-biased, and we presented both sides. But over the years, when I've done these videos, invariably people have asked me, how are you voting? And I've always been reluctant to go ahead and give my views, especially when I'm talking to my students, because I feel like I have an undue influence on them. And so I've avoided doing that. But after giving it some thought, I'm going to tell you not how I think you should vote, and I'm not recommending how you should vote. I'm just telling you how I think about these propositions. And then you can take that for what it's worth. You can agree with me or disagree with me, whatever. So on Proposition 2, the school bond initiative, I might be biased, right? I am a college professor, but I think investing in education is a good thing. I also like in that proposition the emphasis on technical education, right? Because the world needs plumbers as well as it needs political scientists. And as some of you know, prior to getting my PhD, I was a plumber and a plumbing contractor. Also, research suggests that there are a lot of benefits from starting school early and that they have a significant impact on student success. And so the idea of emphasizing transitional kindergarten, I think, is good. Plus, I'm something of an institutionalist, meaning that unlike most people, I trust the legislative process. So when a bill survives the legislative process and is supported by Democrats and Republicans, I tend to defer to their judgment. Not always, as you'll see, but I tend to defer to that judgment. So I will definitely be voting yes on Proposition 2. Proposition 3 for me is a no-brainer. Like 70% of Californians, I support same-sex marriage. And while opponents argue that changing the Constitution is unnecessary because the federal courts have already declared that laws prohibiting same-sex marriage are unconstitutional, I don't find that argument persuasive for two reasons. Well, one main reason. First, as we've seen, the current Supreme Court has already made decisions that ignore long-standing precedent. Right? In the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, they ended a right that was constitutionally protected for many years. I do not think it's far-fetched to think that they may come to the same conclusion and rule that states, not federal courts, have the authority to define what does and does not constitute marriage. And I think you could even make an argument that the 10th Amendment gives states the right to define marriage. And so I think placing it in the California Constitution is a good idea for California. Proposition 4 actually is difficult for me. See, I'm very concerned about the impact of climate change on communities near the coast. We have experienced droughts before, and other parts of the country recently have experienced severe climate-related damage, floods, right? At the same time, it is the case that California is facing a budget deficit. And given those concerns, I was troubled as I was studying this initiative that it included $700 million to improve recreational spaces and trails and green areas to state and local parks. Not that I don't think that's important. Not that I don't value that myself. But to me, the dangers that presented by climate change are, in my estimation, real and getting more severe. So I would have preferred to see a bond that focused exclusively on those challenges. So with some reservations, I will support Proposition 4. Proposition 5 is the one that deals with rent control. Now, I think everybody would agree, and certainly everybody who's a renter would agree, that the cost of housing is out of control. At the same time, I worry that if local governments adopt highly restrictive rent control policies, rather than improving the housing crisis, it will actually make things worse because there'll be no incentive for people to build or invest in affordable housing. And that's a real concern. And at the same time, I have a problem with the idea that if a majority of citizens support establishing rent control policies, that 1/3 of them should be able to prevent that from happening. And that's precisely what the 2/3 threshold does, right? Right now, to go ahead and do those kinds of bond measures, it requires a 2/3 majority. So it gives 1/3 of the population the ability to prevent the remaining 2/3 to adopt their own preferred policies. There's something fundamentally undemocratic about that. And so ultimately, I think it's a good idea, and I will vote in favor of Proposition 5. Proposition 6. I will support this measure. To be perfectly honest, I really haven't given much thought to this issue. And when I first read the initiative, and it referred to involuntary servitude, it struck a nerve with me. Because the term involuntary servitude is usually associated with slavery. Prisoners, people who have been arrested, tried, convicted, they aren't like slaves. They broke the law, they were found guilty, and they're serving a sentence. At the same time, when I started thinking about forced labor, that thought of forced labor, I thought about reports about forced labor camps in China. And when I looked at it from that perspective, it suddenly seemed very barbaric to me, a barbaric practice. Additionally, while I honestly haven't seen any studies on this, my sense is that there's no rehabilitative value in forcing people to work. The idea that compelling people to work teaches them responsibility is problematic at best to me. And so I will vote yes on Proposition 6. As far as the other propositions go, I have to confess that I have a bias. As I said before, I'm an institutionalist. I want bills to go through the legislative process. I want hearings where people with opposing views and interests present their arguments to our legislators, right? I want our legislators to come up with compromises in order to pass legislation. I trust that process, right? I know there are a lot of people who don't trust politicians. I do. And I frequently tell my students that a good bill is one that gets overwhelming support, but the people who voted in favor of it are unhappy. And the reason they're unhappy is because they had to compromise a little bit. They didn't get exactly what they want. I think that's a good thing. At the same time, I like the idea that the people of California, if they really want something to become law and our legislators are unwilling to do it, we can do it ourselves. It's direct democracy. It's a good thing. We can gather enough valid signatures and then pass a law even when our state legislatures refuse to take action. And in theory, I think that's a great idea. But in practice, though, that's not how the initiative process usually works. Instead, what happens is, instead of it being a citizens' initiative, which is how we typically talk about it, right? Special interest groups hire people to gather signatures, and they spend a lot of money on commercials that are oftentimes filled with specious arguments, and specious is like a gentle word that I'm using, specious arguments, to try to advance their own financial or personal interests. Now, when I was younger, if I saw somebody saying, hey, will you sign this petition to get this on the ballot? I was like, yeah, let's let the people decide. You want to get something on the ballot? That's fine. Let people decide on what they want. I don't feel that way any longer. I've seen the way that the initiative process has been used. And even when there are propositions that I kind of agree with the idea of what they're doing, I still have problems with it. So, for example, while I generally support the idea of increasing the minimum wage, that's Proposition 32, I would like to see it raised through the regular legislative process. Likewise, while I generally support the idea of local governments being able to set rent control policies, once again, that's something that I would like to see go through the normal legislative process. Proposition 34 is, in my estimation, everything that's wrong about the initiative process in California. It's being sponsored by the head of the California Apartments Association, and based on the research that I did, it's not motivated by a desire to ensure that money is spent on direct patient care. That's why I was so confused when it kept referring to spending on political activities. So I will vote no on Proposition 32, Proposition 33, and Proposition 34. Proposition 35 is one of the more confounding propositions. That's the one that makes tax on healthcare programs permanent. And at the risk of repeating myself, this is precisely the kind of complicated policy that, in my view, benefits from the legislative process. What makes this proposition particularly weird is that it's endorsed by both political parties. The California Democratic Party endorses it. The California Republican Party endorses it. But if they both agree on it, why wasn't it passed through the legislature? Why didn't it go through that normal process? So I'm going to vote no. If they think it's a good idea, I want them to put it on the floor. I want it to go through committees, and I want them to vote on it. And then they can refer it to the people. And then I will consider it on its merits. And quite frankly, if everybody agrees on it, I will probably go ahead and support it. As for Proposition 36, for those of you who are old enough to understand this metaphor, I'm going to sound like a broken record, repeating the same thing over and over again. The kind of complicated policy decisions these are exactly the kind of policy decisions that I would like to see make their way through the legislative process. There are so many potential costs and benefits that can result from the change in sentencing policies. I want our legislators to hold hearings, to hear from the experts, and to make a decision accordingly. For example, I don't think a policy of mass incarceration is effective at reducing crime. At the same time, I think people who engage in crime are clearly encouraged to continue to do so when the penalties associated with those crimes are reduced. The question is the balancing act, because the message that sends to them is that crime is not that big of a deal and you're not going to have to serve that much time. But the initiative process is something that I find problematic. And so for me, personally, while I'm concerned about crime, while I'm concerned about people, repeat offenders, I'm going to vote no on this, and I'm going to encourage my legislators to go ahead and address this issue. Now again, you might agree with me. My views may be out of step with yours and with many other people. It may be that my views are unusual because I'm a political scientist and I look at things differently than other people. Hell, for all I know, it may be because I used to be a plumber. I think about things differently. But this is how I try and make sense of the propositions on the ballot. If you come to a different conclusion, good, I'm fine with that. I understand that. That's what makes democracy democracy. But people have asked me what they thought, what my opinions were on these propositions, and so there you have it for whatever it's worth. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and good luck.